This psalm talks about singing a new song. And I only want to suggest this morning. Your life itself is that new song. But you can't learn to sing that song until you realize the song of your life is not about your life. Only then can we sing the song with clarity and beauty and truth. Now, the first part of what I just said would not be at all controversial today, right? Sing the song of your life. That's the rallying cry of the cult of authenticity. Be yourself. Be authentic. Stop wearing masks. Discover who you are and then let that who sing. And of course, the patron saint of this cult of authenticity is that 19th century American poet, Walt Whitman. You might remember, not very much, but maybe one line from that 11th grade American literature class. Maybe just the first line of his most famous poem, Song of Myself. I celebrate myself. I sing myself. And then a few pages later, because it's a long poem, a few pages later he says, and nothing, not God, is greater to one than one's self. Now, scholars will say, when Whitman says self, he doesn't mean his own individual self. It's more philosophically complicated than that. It's the transcendental self, but that's not how we remember him. We remember him as that poet who exploited free verse, who broke the mold, who broke out of the confines of traditional categories and forms in poetry so that his poetry could celebrate individuality and authenticity. I celebrate myself. I sing myself. And of course, since then, it wouldn't be at all controversial to say, sing the song of your life. Be yourself. Be authentic. Stop wearing masks. Sing who you are. The Psalm 40 says to sing a new song, and even though I want to suggest our own lives are that new song, that's not at all the same as singing the song of myself. For as the psalm makes clear pretty early on, the song is not about me. I am not the subject of the song. The psalmist writes, He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. I might be the singer of this song of my life, but I'm not the subject. The subject, or as we would have said in that 11th grade American literature class, the protagonist is God. In fact, the psalmist couldn't even have begun to sing this song if it hadn't been for the saving help of God in his life. God, he writes, drew me up out of a desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Now, if we listened to the writer of the psalm singing the song of his life, it might sound like it's the story of his life, the trouble he was in, the pit he needed to get out of, the sins he had committed. The narrative events might have been events in his life, but it wasn't about him. When he sings the song of his life and others hear it, the song does not call attention to himself or to itself, but it points to God. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. And many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. For Christians, one of the great examples we have in Christian history of someone who sang the song of his life this way is that great 4th and 5th century theologian and bishop, St. Augustine. When St. Augustine wrote his Confessions, he was as groundbreaking as Walt Whitman was with his poetry. He broke the mold. No one had ever written a narrative so personal and intimate as Augustine's Confessions before. There was not a genre that existed in which this piece could be categorized. Now today we have something called autobiography and memoir. And so we might look at his book and say, oh, it's just one of those. But Augustine's Confession, some of you have read it. Who's read it? All these divinity students have read it. Oh, that's pretty good, a third of you. Augustine's Confessions could not be more different from modern-day memoir and autobiography. Right? Memoirs so often, not all of them, but so often are self-referential and self-gratifying and self-indulgent. But Augustine's Confessions are not about himself at all. Of course, we learn about Augustine a little bit. We learn that he was a greedy little nurser when he was an infant, always wanting more. How he stole that pear when he was an adolescent and felt guilty about it later. How he broke his Christian mama's heart like some of you did when he left the Christian faith as a teenager behind. How he had a son with the woman he lived with who wasn't his wife. How he eventually came to accept the truth of Christianity. We learn about Augustine's life, but the point is to point to God. To point to God who was there with him from the very beginning. To point to the God who forgave him. To the God who throughout his life was searching for him and wooing him. The story looks like it's about Augustine, but it's really about this faithful, searching, forgiving, praiseworthy God. The psalm talks about a new song. But it's not a song of myself. It's a song of praise to a praiseworthy God. Well, there's another reason this new song is not like a song of myself. This is a song we can't discover on our own or write on our own. We can't just go on a pilgrimage and spend a few years roaming through hostels in Europe to discover who we really are and then sing the song of ourselves. It's not a song we can discover or unearth or let alone write on our own. It's a song we receive. Once again, that early on verse in the psalm, he put a new song in my mouth. God put the song there. Because the only song the psalmist knows in himself is a discordant cry for help. That's the only song he can find in himself. On the one hand, it's a cry for help from those external forces that are pressing in on him. And we all know how circumstances outside of ourselves can bend and twist the songs of our lives, don't we? How those gathered on the steps of our nation's capital on Friday were crying out because the song of their lives had been interrupted by gun violence. Or how 50 years ago, as Duke celebrated this week, how 50 years ago African American students were crying out to help Duke see beyond a reality of segregation, but whose songs were muted by racism and fear. Or the cries of malnourished children in our own community, or the cries of the neglected elderly in our own community, or the cries of those who are forced to sing a song that is not theirs. We know, don't we, how forces outside of ourselves can bend and twist the melodies of our lives. But the writer of this psalm also knew that the melody of his life, so to speak, could also be bent and twisted by his own sin. My iniquities, he says, have overtaken me. They're more than the numbers of my head. Sometimes the pit he's fallen in is like the pit Joseph in Genesis. Remember? Joseph fell in the pit that his brothers dug for him. But sometimes he falls into the pit because of his own missteps or mistakes and misdirection. Either way, the only song he can find in himself is a cry for help. And when I talk about a new song of praise to our God, I wonder if some of you are thinking, come on, you don't know my life. You don't know my circumstances. You don't know the boss I work for. You don't know the home I live in. You don't know how it seems like everywhere I go, people are out to get me. You don't know how the system is stacked against people like me. You don't know. Or maybe you're thinking, that sounds great, but you don't know the mistakes I've made, the wrong turns I've chosen to take. You don't know the pits that I've dug for myself. You don't know my past. The only song I could sing is a song of lament. Of course, that's true. And that's why when I read this psalm, as I do quite frequently, there's one little word that I latch onto: new. It's a new song. It's not the song we've written for ourselves over the years. It's not the song others have written for us over the years. Let's not sing those songs today. It's a new song. It's a song we're given, and it's a song we can receive. And the best part is, when we learn, it's the paradox of it, when we learn to sing this new song, we become more truly ourselves than we ever were. Think of the Apostle Paul. Remember the Apostle Paul. Before he was the Apostle Paul, remember how he was known to the early church? As a persecutor of those who followed Jesus, as one who breathed threats and violence against the church. That was his song. But then he met Jesus in a bright light on the road to Damascus, and his song changed. But he was still himself. He was still fiery and stubborn. He was still zealous and pugnacious. He was still himself. In fact, he was more truly himself than he was before, because his song was no longer the twisted song of fear and bigotry and hate, but his song was a song of praise to God. And in fact, many did hear that song and fear and put their trust in the Lord, and that's why we're here today. So I wonder, how about you? What song is your life singing? Is your song right now just a shrill cry for help? A cry for forgiveness, for help from and healing from those wounds that have been inflicted on you or wounds you've inflicted yourself? Does your cry feel like a shout from the bottom of a pit? Of course, our songs are so often out of tune and off key. That's what in Christianity we mean when we say, as Paul said in the book of Romans, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Our songs are off key. The original song of love that God sang in creation and in each one of us has been thrown off key. We're kind of like the piano in the living room of my home back in Shelbyville, because that living room is surrounded by windows. And so when it gets cold in the winter and then the heat comes on, the temperature of that piano for 4 months is constantly going up and down. And by the time spring comes, we wouldn't dare touch the thing until we've called the tuner. Of course, the songs of our lives are so often out of tune. But the good news of the gospel is it doesn't have to be that way. We can hear and hear again that new song being sung in the life of Jesus. We can hear it. The psalm says, "You've given me an open ear." It literally says, "Ears you have dug for me." It was hard work for God to open our ears. But we can have open ears and listen to this new song. The song of steadfast love and faithfulness the psalmist is talking about, we can hear in the life of Jesus. And when we listen with open ears and let that song enter us, it can transform us so that our own lives can begin to sing it. So our lives can become, in their own unique way, variations on that theme of God's love. Our lives lifted up, our lives forgiven, can then resonate with the harmony of God's song for others to hear. Not, of course, a song we've written for ourselves or a song that we have managed to discover on our own, but a song of grace given to us and received. A song of praise to our God. And when we have done that, when we have begun to live a life that receives and sings this song of God's praise, then I'm not ashamed to say, be yourself. Be authentic. Stop wearing masks. Sing who you are. Amen.